be here. It's actually my first time in Sweden. Unfortunately, shortly after finishing my presentation, I've got to run out the door to get a train to go back to the UK. So I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to be here all day. But I think in the time that I'm here, I'm hoping to both answer some of your questions and perhaps raise some further questions in your minds about whether fair trade is making a difference. I mean, from my perspective, I am actually a supporter of fair trade, and that is based on my research experience, which, as Bjorn said, covers a number of countries, sectors, products, and over a number of years. But I also am quite clear that there are a number of challenges in the future for fair trade to really have a more substantial and significant impact on sustainable development. So, I'm going to talk about three main areas of fair trade impact: economic impact, social impact, which I've broken down into quality of life and empowerment, and environmental impact. And I want to point out that obviously these three areas of impact are very much interrelated and interdependent, but I'm going to be speaking about them separately purely for time and clarification reasons. We can also talk about avenues of fair trade impact. This is kind of otherwise known as pathways of impact, impact pathways or theories of change. And the reason for looking at avenues of fair trade impact is actually about learning. And I've always, in my research, been very keen to not just be looking at proving fair trade impact or disproving any impact, but also to look at how fair trade can be improved. And in order to do that, looking at avenues of fair trade impact is actually very useful because it gives us a sense of what's working in the fair trade system and what isn't working, what could be improved, how it could be improved. And these are the four main avenues of fair trade impact that we've identified related to labelled fair trade. I should point out that today I'm talking just about labelled fair trade. I'm not talking about the more kind of traditional, what I call alternative fair trade channels, which are typically in handicrafts and textile products. So I'm talking about flow-related fair trade. And so the four main avenues of impact are the producer standards, which set out the kind of conditions under which producer organisations and hired labour situations, i.e. plantations, need to be operating in order to join the fair trade system. The second avenue is the trade standards, which is what most people associate most closely with fair trade, i.e. the fair trade minimum prices, the fair trade premium for business and social and community investments, also the long-term relationships that fair trade principles embody, and also payment of advance payment for products, a pre-finance that is included in some product areas. The third area of fair trade or avenue for fair trade impact is actually one that's often not necessarily recognised, which is organisational support. And producer organisations receive quite a range of support, both from fair trade organisations such as Flow, Labour Initiatives, trading partners and so forth, but also from NGOs, government institutions, which are often linked to the status as a fair trade producer. And finally, networks is the other avenue through which fair trade can have an impact. And in recent years, there's been quite a lot of focus on building up networks of fair trade producers, and those have their own kind of set of impacts. The evidence base that I'm going to be drawing on today is largely, there was a review done of all the kind of published impact studies, I think principally in English, so I'm not sure if any Swedish studies would have been included in this, by the Natural Resources Institute, which is the University of Greenwich in the UK. It was actually commissioned by the Fair Trade Foundation. And this drew on 38 impact studies and tried to kind of aggregate the findings from those studies to provide some clarity about whether fair trade is making a difference or not. The review was limited in some senses, or rather the findings are limited in some senses, because the large majority of studies are actually with coffee producers. There are very few studies on other sectors. There are also, the majority of studies were from Latin America and the Caribbean. This is quite closely linked to the coffee production, which is where fair trade kind of originated, or labelled fair trade originated. And there are very few studies on workers. As I'm sure you know, quite a lot of fair trade or flow labelled products now come from plantations. And there are very few studies on the impact of fair trade in that situation, and a few studies on fair trade impact in other sectors and other regions. So I'm also drawing on research that we've done at IDS over the last kind of 8 or 9 years looking at fair trade, and not all of these are impact studies. Some of them are more general research, but they do cross over a number of sectors: coffee, tea, cocoa, fresh fruit, etc., and look at fair trade in a number of different countries and continents. And also recently we've just completed a large sector study of fair trade bananas, which draws on research from 4 countries and 6 different producer organisations, both plantations and small producer organisations. So I'm kind of amassing the evidence from my own personal experience and then from this kind of large-scale review. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the economic impact of fair trade. And the vast majority of studies find that there is a positive economic impact on small producers from participation in fair trade in terms of increasing incomes and providing a more stable income. The effect is particularly strong at times when conventional market prices are low, such as, for example, in coffee during the coffee crisis. But if you look at income over time, over the course of time, there is generally a positive impact on income. However, this does depend on the amount of products being sold as fair trade, because in some cases producers are actually selling only a very small percentage as fair trade, whereas in others they can sell up to 100% as fair trade. And it also does depend on the cost of production, and fair trade does actually increase cost of production in a number of different ways, and that obviously can then draw down on the kind of price benefits that you find. Fair trade can also have a number of other economic impacts for small producers. It can improve access to credit, which is actually an important limitation to small producers participating in a good trading environment. It can enable improvements in their quality and transition to organic production. Fair trade premiums, for example, are often used to fund the costs involved in the transition to organic production. And improvements in quality and organic production obviously increase the premiums that producers can receive for their products. It can facilitate the diversification of income sources, which is actually a very important impact. It's perhaps not one of the strongest areas of impact, but in certain cases certainly small producer organisations are working very hard to try and diversify their sources of income. And finally, it can facilitate upgrading in the value chain. Value chain is kind of another term for supply chain. I'm not sure if you use it here in Sweden. But basically, producers through fair trade have been able to move from being individual, fragmented producers in their hundreds of thousands to forming organisations to collectively organise the selling of their products. They have begun processing their products themselves instead of selling raw materials. They've begun exporting directly. Again, many small producer organisations were doing this prior to entering fair trade, but fair trade has also facilitated many others to start exporting directly or to improve their exporting sales.